finance result. What we mean by finance result are those 4 financial results. We talk about generating revenue, realigning existing expenditures, avoiding future expenditures, and better delivery, delivering better with what we have. Those are the outcomes, the results. And so the solution can be quite complicated. It can be an incentive. It can be a tax. It can be a range of taxes. It can be, the idea is to think in systems. And there are these steps that we go through to do the finance plan. The idea of this finance plan is one that we've been developing over the course of BIOFIN process. So now we're sort of 4 years. It's because it's the last part of the methodology of the process. Not all countries have completed them, but some have, and we'll learn a bit from them today. But just as a reminder, you start finding potential finance solutions throughout the 3 assessments: the PIR, the expenditure review, and the financial needs assessment. There's also a catalog. I'll mention that in a little bit. And then you want to list these existing potential finance solutions. I'm going to talk a lot about that, how you do that. Then you do this prioritization, and then you prepare the plan, which includes technical proposals, business case that supports the plan, and business cases that support the individual finance solutions as well. So, and then, ideally, you come up with this package, what we call a mix of finance solutions that does a few things. The most important thing is it moves the needle on biodiversity finance and management in the country. So if you come up with 5 finance solutions and they're all really small or have a minimum impact, you haven't really done your research well, you haven't done your engagement. If you've got too many that are difficult to implement, then you're not going to achieve it either. So a couple of points here. We say that for the mix should have this financial adequacy. The sum of the resources is going to move that needle. It's going to be measurable and it's significant. You have a diversity of solutions because of risk management. Some of the solutions may take too long, may be too challenging, may come upon the social, political roadblocks, so you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Also, appropriate sequencing. Some of them take a long time to implement. Some of them can be done quickly. If you can identify solutions that are quick wins, that can build interest and engagement in the whole biodiversity finance process and move the agenda forward. And then you really want to have biodiversity outcomes. Raising money, again, is not the only goal. You can raise a lot of money, but if that money then gets only directed to renewable energy, that's great for renewable energy, but we really want to have an impact on biodiversity. So let's make sure that the money we raise or the actions that we propose are focused on significant outcomes to biodiversity. Okay, this is an area, so in the methodology previously, we've had this, list potential finance solutions. We've added recently, in the last methodology, to list existing finance mechanisms in the country. And I've had a lot of countries say, okay, we kind of get the mechanism part that, there's a tax and there's a fee and this kind of thing, but how do you turn them into solutions? So, I've developed these next few slides to help us think through that. How do you go from the existing situation or from the assessments to specific finance solutions that you can then prioritize to come up with your finance plan? And so these are the steps: listing the existing finance mechanisms for nature in the country. You convert the existing challenges, opportunities, and finance mechanisms into potential finance solutions. These come from, again, those assessments. Then you review this BIOFIN catalog. You review different solutions online, anywhere you can find them, to come up with new ideas. And then you define these converted existing or the new solutions into very specific descriptions of finance solutions. That specificity, how detailed those descriptions are, really make it's the essential part of this whole process. And then you can begin prioritization. So let's go through these different steps here. So you've got, starting in the biodiversity finance policy and institutional review, you've identified challenges, opportunities. In all of the different assessments, you've come up with finance sources. You understand maybe there's revenues here, protected area fees, there's certain green taxes, there's government budgeting. You've identified all these things. And you try to create this list, massive list, as specific as you can of all these different finance tools. This happens in the PIR, but as you go through the process, you learn more and more, and you come up with all these things. And you want to go through these different types of instruments, regulatory, market, grant, make sure that you've really come up with everything that you can think of, okay? And then you want to convert these existing mechanisms and tools into a finance solution. What does that mean? Ask, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Okay, so let's say you have a green tax. There's a tax on polluting, the rivers. Okay, so we say, okay, well, there's a green tax on pollution. That's a mechanism. It exists. Is it working? How could it be improved? How could it be scaled? Some places have water tariffs, but only in certain municipalities. Is there a national water tariff that could be used? Does it need to be changed? Some of them can be dysfunctional. You have environmental impacts studies and statements where companies don't have to pay very much. They don't have to follow their finance plan. So there's a mechanism, an environmental impact study. There's a fee that you pay. It exists. How could it be improved so that there's effectiveness in the implementation of that mechanism? This is what we're asking. And then the specific change to go from state A to state B, that's the finance solution. So for an environmental impact study, it would be, increase the fees for the impact study so that the government can adequately assess the scientific validity of the proposed environmental management plan. That's long. That's very long. That's very detailed. If you just say EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, how do you judge whether that's something that's worth doing? How do you judge the impact of that? Very difficult, because you don't know what it is. So you've got to be very clear, and you write a very clear description of that mechanism. So this other step is reviewing the BIOFIN catalog and the UNDP Financing Solutions website. This is to kind of generate new ideas, make sure you've written down and described all of the existing finance solutions in the country. And then if you come up with new ideas, a lot of people are interested in green bonds. So again, you write green bond, but what is the finance solution? A green bond is a concept. What is the finance solution? So you say, okay, well, maybe we're going to do a green bond to invest in eco-tourism infrastructure in the national parks of the country. That's specific. That's something that you can judge, and that could be new. And so you want to add those to the list, and you'll have these solutions here. So this is the location of the Financing Solutions for Sustainable Development site. There's around 22 different very good descriptions already. We have the BIOFIN catalog, which includes all those finance solutions that are described on the wall, plus another 100 or so. So that's up. And then this last step here is converting these existing or new mechanisms into very specific finance solutions to be prioritized. I think I covered a lot of this to be very specific, but you basically want to end up with a name, a very specific name. Again, EIA is not a finance solution. What are you doing to the EIA? A green tax is not a finance solution. It's a concept. So define it specifically, and then do 2 to 3 sentences that really capture what it is you're trying to do, and that's what you're going to to prioritize in the next stage. And for that, I'm going to pass it back to Tracy, and thank you. And we'd love to hear feedback on these concepts because it's relatively new.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to look at screening. I don't know if I'm shorter than Dave. I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about screening and prioritizing finance solutions, the next step. So a couple of key things to bring in and think about before you start or as you prepare for the screening and prioritization process is making sure you have a careful selection of experts and participants for workshops, that you need to ask the right people the questions that you need to ask. You need to have the right people in the room, either all together or one-on-one engagements. You need detailed descriptions and explanatory information for each finance solution. Practically, it can get tricky when you're dealing with 200 finance solutions. So in your first level of screening, don't kill yourself having pages of information on each finance solution. But definitely, as you're moving to the second level of prioritization, you need enough information to be able to screen and prioritize. And then you should be cross-checking your scoring, because this is a scoring process. You should be cross-checking it with literature and work in other countries. There might be things you can learn from other countries, whether it's good stuff or bad stuff about those finance solutions that you haven't experienced or your own country experts aren't aware of. So as I said, there are two processes to coming up with your final list of finance solutions that you're going to work into your finance plan. The first level, you'd be starting with around, it's quite a big range, but around 50 to 200 finance solutions, and you want to get that right the way down to 15 to 50. 50 is a lot, but you want to get that right down to a smaller set that you then apply a much more rigorous prioritization process to come down to about 5 to 15 finance solutions. Your rapid screening process, you really ask 3 questions, and these are incredibly important questions, and you need to ask all 3 of them. First one is impact, and by that we mean biodiversity impact. What is the potential for biodiversity and sustainable development impact, both amount, so scale, as well as significance? You might be able to leverage a finance solution that has a big impact scale-wise, but it's not a particularly useful ecosystem. How is that important to you? You might be able to leverage a finance solution that's fantastic for a threatened erica flower, but it's only in one little patch. You know, is that of national significance? So you need to think about that. The next question is around the finance of it. So what is the financial scale and sustainability? How much, for how long, how stable? Is it a once-off? Great big amount of money and then that's it? Is it something that you can depend on and work into the system so that you know this new funding source you can use to pay salaries for the next 10 years? So that's the finance sort of question you want to ask. And then there's the sort of reality check. Like, could this actually work? What is the likelihood of success? And that's a practical question. And it's also a political question. There might be some finance solutions that make sense for biodiversity and could bring in a lot of money, but actually they don't respond well to social justice or to the political, the national development focus for the country. And that's a really important question to ask. Your detailed screening process, you then apply to your smaller subset. And here, as I said earlier, you really do need quite a bit of information because you have 19 questions that you need to be able to answer. I'm not putting up all the questions there, but there are a couple at the bottom of some example questions. Is there a positive record of implementation? So is this a totally new idea, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's nicer if there has been some pilots or there's some thinking around it that shows that, you know, we kind of know what we're talking about here and we kind of think it could work. Will it generate leverage, save, or realign a large volume of financial resources? Will financing sources be mobilized in a compatible timeline with needs, or is this going to take 20 years? Will financing sources be stable and predictable? As I mentioned earlier, that's a really important aspect to think about. These 19 questions, let's say you have, for example, 20 finance solutions. You're going to find for a finance solution that it's definitely not going to be yes for each of these 19 finance solutions, and that's okay. What this helps you to do is end up with a priority list of finance solutions that are good enough across these 19 questions. And what I mean by that is you might find a fantastic finance solution that fails at that last question. Will financing sources be stable and predictable? It gets a 0 for that. But that's okay, because you have 5 other finance solutions that got a 5 for that. So you end up with a good mix, a good blend of finance solutions. And that's kind of true for quite a few of these prioritization questions. So I do not speak Spanish, but I know enough about this graph to explain what it is. So this is how Costa Rica displayed their prioritized finance solutions. The bottom line is time. So how long it would take to implement, and the green line going up is, I've totally gone black. Priority, it's priority. And then the size of the circles, the yellow blobs, are scale, the financial scale. So they could show, we've looked at all these things across these finance solutions, and these are our top 9 finance solutions. Who's going to volunteer reading out what the first one is? Because I'd love to know what it is. Come on, someone. What's the top one there? Please tell me. Don't hold me in suspense. Come.
I can read in Spanish, but I have no idea what it is. Use of disponible por su gestión, administración, cartera de proyecto, administration of environmental project portfolio, use of available por su subejecución, use of available, I don't know what, for sub-execution and administration of environmental project portfolio.
So that was the top, you can keep that.
Yeah, that is the top.
One. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we now have our top 5 to 15 finance solutions, and we need to formulate technical proposals for these. So this is the next step. I'm going to step back now and draw on my experience in South Africa, because we spent many weeks doing this. What we need when we draft a case for each finance solution is obviously a title, but the title, as Dave mentioned earlier, needs to be very specific. It can't be PES. It needs to be, address water pricing through the water pricing strategy to leverage funds for catchment management in these 4 catchments. It needs to be a specific title that tells you exactly what it is. It's useful to have a box summarizing the case for that solution. So it's not a summary of the solution per se, but it's the argument. We had an argument for every finance solution in a box, same format. So as a reader, you knew if you went to the box for that finance solution, you could get the argument for why that was a great finance solution. Also really important, 1 paragraph up front explaining what the finance solution is. And this isn't just useful for communicating, it's incredibly useful for thinking through the finance solution. How do you fit in this big idea into a paragraph this big that you can then ultimately flip into your executive summary to showcase all of your finance solutions? And it forces you to really distill the idea. We definitely started out thinking we could do this quite easily for each of our finance solutions, and as we were drafting that summary paragraph, went, oh my goodness, we hadn't actually thought about this. Let's quickly speak to this expert or phone this person or Google this to really distill exactly what the finance solution was. You need a section on context. So your biodiversity sector, your conservation sector is a complicated space. You need to help the reader who's not necessarily from your sector. Your reader might be from Treasury or from another department. You need to help them to understand the context of that finance solution. You need a subsection on objectives. What is this actually aiming to do? Is it to get more money in? Is it to save money? How much money? For who? You need a section on expected financial results and a subsection on next steps, a table with milestones. Something we bumped up against when we were developing this. We had a very long finance plan. It ended up being about 160 pages. We had 16 finance solutions. And we didn't have the time to develop detailed work plans for each finance solution. Not only did we not have the time, these finance solutions hadn't gone out, hadn't been presented as a holistic plan. They hadn't been agreed upon by the minister, so we didn't want to spend the next 9 months developing detailed plans for these things. But we did want to show next steps, so stakeholders who read these could understand, okay, these are the key stakeholders, this is what they would need to do, and this is how long it would take, theoretically, to actually create this finance solution, get it going. So I've already expanded a bit on the summary paragraphs. This is that one at the top, but just to go back to that and bed it down. The summary paragraph forces you to be clear about the finance mechanism. It also is a great communication tool. You can also flip it into into PowerPoints quite easily. It's really useful when you suddenly asked to present on your finance solutions. Brief, 5 to 6 sentences, gives a background or justification, gives an opportunity. Why now? Why should we be doing this now? Has to be very specific, has to show expected impact, and give key steps. So I'm going to read one. I'm going to break a cardinal rule with PowerPoints and have lots of words on one PowerPoint. But this is an example of one of our finance solutions. Investing in ecological infrastructure as part of catchment management offers significant water regulation and supply benefits, along with co-benefits for biodiversity, livelihoods, and disaster risk reduction. Currently, so this is the problem, currently negligible financing for catchment management is derived directly from water users, even though the user pays principle, which is embedded in legal instruments relevant to water management, suggests that significant realignment of user fees towards such management would be a socio-economically efficient outcome. This finance solution aims, so we've done context, we've done problem. Now we're talking about what we actually want to do. This finance solution aims to improve existing and establish new viable ways to capture and distribute an adequate portion of water tariffs for investment in ecological infrastructure. This would be achieved by operationalizing elements of the revised draft water pricing strategy, that's my shorthand, sorry, therefore referred to as water pricing strategy, which is yet to be promulgated and which provides scope for channeling a proportion of water tariffs into ecological management of catchments. Very specific. People really understand what we're talking about here. It's a little dry because it's talking about policy, but we're very clear. We're not saying PES. We're not saying capture funding from water into catchments. We're being specific on what we need to do here. And that's me for now. Over to Dave for the next step.
Oops. Thank you, Tracy. So yeah, that paragraph is key. If you can write a really clear paragraph like that, that's specific, that the reader understands it, half the battle is won. Writing the rest of your description, your technical summary of the finance solution is so much easier when you have that clear paragraph, right, Hugo? Okay, so anyway, so that's, again, we wanted to really reinforce that point. The business case is something that we've also got a lot of questions on, and you'll have the chance. It is one of the topics. Is the business case? Yeah. So I'll kind of save some detail for that, but just remember that there are different audiences that you may want to address, and different audiences have different objectives. You know, governments may be more interested in economic and social returns, GDP impact. The private sector is looking at their own benefit. So if the solution addresses one of these target audiences, make sure that your business case addresses their needs and their interests. Development partners and philanthropists. There's two levels of the business case, right? So one is the plan level, which is basically a justification for why this finance plan is worth doing. Why invest in this? Why do it? And it's a kind of a shorthand for why invest in biodiversity. So for that, you need, you know, some economic arguments, what's important to the country, things like that. The solution levels, each finance solution should have its own justification, should have its own economic reason to do it, its own social reason, of course its own biodiversity reason, and you want to make sure that that's clearly elaborated because you want each finance solution to be something that you want to do. Here's an example from a very interesting fund that's investing in biodiversity and carbon, the Althelia Fund. Andrew Mitchell mentioned it earlier, but this is a look at what some of their financial return on investment, social return on investment is. So here, the top number, the 20 million, the small print says it's 20 million euros that is received by local stakeholders from the sale of carbon credits by 2021. That's their objective for this part of the fund. Also, in excess of 11 million euros received by local stakeholders from the sale of other goods and services. They invest in carbon, like protecting forests, but also agrobiodiversity, so cocoa producers, coffee, things like that. So you've got physical products that they're trying to improve the sale of, and you have carbon offsets that they're selling on the market. And then there's a social return on investment, which is this lower number, 120 million euros, which is the total benefits that including the supply chain, spending, and economic multipliers. That's your economic justification. So if you could come up with numbers like this for each finance solution, I think you've got a strong argument for the decision makers. Finally, just the final step here is reporting, drafting, and I think we covered a lot of that, but just remember that you know, it's BIOFIN's final written product. You know, it should be owned and really taken on by government, by your stakeholders. It's not something that BIOFIN does, and you know, it's not for the UNDP here. And we want the highest level of partners' engagement for this, because in a way you've been building up your stakeholder engagement and partners' engagement throughout the whole process. This is the one that you really want full buy-in and ownership. And maybe there's an approval process, but you don't want that to block your actual implementation of it. So, and then my next slide. Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions, yeah? Okay, so we have time for a few questions. Is there a microphone out there in the audience? Not yet, maybe? Okay. So, and then you'll have a chance to grill the other experts as well. So just any clarifying questions on what we've presented.
Thank you. I was wondering, on the example of the summary of the financing solution you presented, how useful is it to put in some data in there on like expenditure review or ecosystem situation, like, because I would sense it would be very useful, like, to make the case, but it can also be kind of overwhelming. So I don't know how you put these data in there.
Thanks, Dave. Are you happy that I respond?
So we spent all this time doing the policy institutional review, the expenditure review, the financial needs assessment. We generate a lot of numbers. And I think that the instinct is to put as much of that in as we can, because we work so hard to generate these conclusions. But you really want to think about the reader, what arguments they want to hear. So yeah, there is definitely a section in the plan that's going to summarize what the larger problem is, what the need is. But you want to be careful not to overwhelm the reader with numbers, right? And then secondly, when those numbers can be tied to specific solutions, definitely put them in, because if they can contribute to the argument, to the business case, to the economic justification, or are the part of the background context of why the solution is important to the country now. Is that okay?
Can I add to that? I find, so you've got two levels of cases, as Dave said. You've got your main case for, like, why should you have a biodiversity finance plan? Why should you care at all? And then you've got your case for each finance solution. And it's a presentation process, your biodiversity finance plan. You're trying to get people to buy in and to support this and potentially fund it or create a program around this sort of work. In the main body of text, it's useful to pull out key pieces of data, but you don't want to turn off your reader, especially if they're not hardcore technical people, they're higher level. But what you can do, because you will also have technical people reading your document wanting some level of legitimacy or saying, you refer to a BER, where are the numbers? You can put something in a box. So your main reader doesn't have to read it, but your technical person knows it's there and they can read the numbers, or even in an appendix. So it's there, but you're not forced to read it if you just want the main cell.
Other questions?
Thank you. My question is, when you have the first category of 40 to 200, that's when you have that paragraph, like description, or you can first wait until you reach maybe 14 to 50, then you have the paragraph. Because maybe you have the concept at 40 to 200, they are concepts, and then you develop them into specific finance solutions when you reach at the 14 to 50 category. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So that paragraph, that detailed paragraph with all the elements, that's only for your final solutions, right? However, what I was suggesting initially was to have a very detailed name and 2 to 3 sentences. You could do it in 1 sentence, too. You could do it in 1 sentence, but you need to describe it so that when you're doing, even your 200, at least there's a description that people know what they're evaluating. Oftentimes, I mean, we have really a great list of finance solutions here. So if you list one of them, like, for example, climate bonds, okay? So climate bonds, how would you score that in terms of its impact, its financial, or likelihood of success? It's too vague. A climate bond is too general, too vague. So if you say, you know, a national sovereign climate bond targeted towards agricultural carbon retention, at least that's something a bit more specific. That's the level at that 200 height. You know, you don't necessarily need to go more specific or more detailed. Otherwise, it'll take forever. Yeah, and oftentimes you don't know. A lot of the real detail you only figure out when you're going down more. Other questions? Maybe one more question, then we'll go to the panel. Everyone wants the panel. Panel, enough of us. Okay. Any more questions? No. All right, let's get the panel up, yeah?
Okay, so I'm going to abuse the mic and just add one more thing, which I probably should have said on our prioritization slides. Something that we found in our country when we were doing this, and a number of other countries I've been working with, is when you're prioritizing both levels, you are not at all prioritizing a solution by, this is something BIOFIN will implement. That is not what this is about. You are prioritizing finance solutions for the country, regardless of who would implement it. Your finance plan is there to be owned by the country, whether it's a department or whether it's the whole sector. That's for you to decide. But it's not, you should never kick out a finance solution because you don't think BIOFIN will implement it. That's what you do when your finance plan is finished, it's signed off, and your team then says, okay, of this plan for the country, what can BIOFIN implement? So please don't confuse those steps. Okay, now we have 3 experts that are going to come up. Lionel from Chile, if you can come up. Hugo, who did finance plan for South Africa and Georgia. And Marie-May from the Seychelles. You're going to start. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question for each of the panelists. And then we're going to open the floor again, and you've got opportunity to ask a question for any of the 5 of us, or anyone in the room, really. So that's more open space. But I'm going to start with 3 questions that I prepared. Firstly, for Chile, what prioritization process did you use in your country? How was it challenging, and how was it effective?
Thank you. Good morning. There are 3 questions in one. I'm going to try to answer all of them. Okay, the first one is that we have a lot of internal discussion to analyze what were the methodological options for developing the financial plan, At the moment we start working on the financial plan, we didn't have such a clear methodology as you showed, and David. So we came to realize that a financial plan has two important dimensions. One is political, and the other is technical. The technical dimension has to do with the financial capacity of the financial plan, that is the capacity to mobilize private resources, the private sector mainly, and also the capacity to optimize public expenditure, because we realize that a lot of the public expenditure can be more effective and have greater impact on biodiversity. There's a room for improvement there. On the political side, on the political dimension, we realize that we need to make it happen, the financial plan, we need to have a political will. And to get political will, we are talking about the feasibility to make it possible for the plan to last until 2030. And how we did it, actually we consulted more than 20 national experts from the private, from the public sector, and we complemented that information with the analysis, careful analysis of the national and international experiences. Later, we shared some of the initial output, the initial draft, with the purpose of receive some feedback from the government, particularly from the finance ministry, Ministry of Economy, as well as the environment. After that, we developed a second draft that we are still working with Marlon to have the final version. As far as the challenges that we are confronting in Chile, they are very political. The first one has to do with the capacity to engage the new government. Next week, on Sunday, a new government is taking office in Chile, a government from a different political sign. So we have to make sure that they also are inclined or they want to support this plan. So that we have an important political challenge there. A second challenge is to have a close partnership with the private sector. Without the private sector, we go back to business as usual. That is not the idea of the Chilean financial plan. The third challenge is to move ahead with the strengthening of the environmental institution in Chile. Particularly, this service that is called the Biodiversity and Protected Area Services by Congress. We are waiting for the approval by Congress of this service that will be very critical to improve the chance to apply economic mechanism to finance biodiversity, particularly the offset mechanism. As far as the effectiveness, it's too early to say how effective the plan is. It's a year old only, maybe less. So but we have some positive view. What is the positive view? For the first time, Chile has a long-term policy, a long-term plan to finance biodiversity. This is the first time in the country that is aligned with the 20 Aichi goals, so that's very critical. The second one is that there is a paradigm shift. The country is moving away from the business as usual, and take a look to the option that the private sector and a better budget expenditure can do for the country. And finally, the other result or early result is that we were able to try some of the pilots that we have in some of the financial mechanisms, particularly the offset. And we are working with the environmental ministry and the Ministry of Economy to see how we can improve what we have already in Chile. Some of the secret of a successful financial plan has to do with the idea of reviewing what we have and see how we can make it work better. And particularly from the private sector, but also from the public expenditure. That's it.
Thank you. That was that was very interesting. Something you said quite early on, a challenge with political will, was something we found quite interesting to balance, because a lot of the BIOFIN work, not just the BFP, but all the BIOFIN work, is very technical. So you end up being locked behind doors with laptops and experts trying to fill out Excel spreadsheets. But you need to be aware that this is also a political process, and you need to emerge from your Excel spreadsheets and continue to have discussions with people outside of that technical space. Okay, Hugo, over to you. Switching to the business case work, what key insights do you have in terms of presenting the business cases for each finance solution and for the plan as a whole?
Right, so I think I'll sort of divide it up into those two issues, the overall case and then for individual solutions. And I'll just start by saying there's no sort of panacea or silver bullet that's going to kind of work in every single case. You really do need to be as targeted as possible and do things like stakeholder mapping. We heard yesterday, I don't know who was in the session, from Biodiversity Institute representatives in South Africa. In their case, it was a question of really rigorously going out to stakeholders and understanding what would appeal to them in terms of the messages that they thought would work. And the results were quite interesting. One of them was that people are not so much interested in the doom and gloom aspect. They want to hear positive messages. I think that's something that's also come through with some of our experiences. You want to appeal to the emotions of especially decision makers. I found that if you are presenting an opportunity to them to be an innovator, to be someone that is really at the forefront of things, then that is appealing, and it's a positive message and sort of aspect to hook onto. So I think understanding stakeholders and understanding your audience, fairly obvious, but it's really something that's worth doing properly and really looking at carefully. In terms of then, tailoring your message to different audiences, it's the same thing. You really need to understand what they're looking for, and it really does differ. If you are trying to make the case essentially to finance ministry people, that I would imagine is more a technical situation. You'll find, or we found, that they're interested in cost-benefit analysis, they're interested in metrics like return on investment. They really want to see that, so that has to be there. If it's a wider issue, you want to talk about policy compatibility. How does this solution and this overall plan further the overall socioeconomic development policy of a country? I think that's a key aspect, and that is a lot of what policymakers are looking for. They want to be able to say, okay, if I support this, then I'm also supporting these important national plans, especially from a socioeconomic point of view, because I suppose there's this misconception that if one is supporting these kinds of initiatives in biodiversity and ecosystem services initiatives, that you somehow are not really supporting the proper economic and socioeconomic development, which is, of course, we know not the case, but one has to make those arguments, and sometimes in fairly simple ways. I think, having said that one wants to target, you're not always going to have the resources to do this. So then you need to have a little bit of a toolbox. You need to have the more softer arguments, good stories to make your case, the more technical side as much as you can, using different metrics, appealing to things like national heritage arguments, etc. You want to also have your bases covered to an extent so that you can draw on these different arguments for your different audiences that you are likely to come across. Then other experiences from just maybe some examples, making the case for protected areas. I'll give you an example. We did some work in Ethiopia, and the key thing that was needed there was twofold. One was benchmarking, just essentially showing to high-level decision makers that at this point in time, the amount that your country spends on protected areas management is substantially and almost incredibly much lower than the average for other countries at a similar level of development. So that gets them thinking in a way, and in a way it also embarrasses them. I mean, it's not a good thing to be sitting at the very bottom of the scale relative to other countries. And the other thing that was needed was a fairly rigorous cost-benefit analysis. It was basically just saying, okay, if you're investing this much money in protected areas, what are your returns going to be like in terms of financial returns? You know, that's from entry fees, concession fees, etc., but also socioeconomic benefits. That's tourism expenditure coming into areas, job creation, etc. And then just maybe a final point is really persistence and waiting for your time to come. Also yesterday we heard, and I'm from Cape Town, we now are sitting with a massive drought. It's even made it onto international news. And this has presented a fantastic opportunity to push for one of the solutions which Tracy essentially described earlier, which is around water pricing and around this water issue is now so prominent that there's a gap. And one needs to sort of be persistent and choose your moment. You might find that your first time that you want to make the case for additional finance from government, there's a massive fiscal constraint in the country, so your likelihood of success is maybe fairly low at that point. But you need to bide your time sometimes for these bigger changes, especially in fiscal allocations to biodiversity.
Thanks, Hugo. That was very interesting, and something you said made me think of Fernanda's question earlier about Ethiopia and benchmarking. And if you've done the BER, having a one-liner saying, this country spends 0.5% on biodiversity, which is lower than the average, which is around 0.9%, you need to address that. So that's a great use of data, that you have a one-liner or a two-liner in your finance plan to just trigger some kind of response. Marie-May, Seychelles. We're moving now to institutionalizing a BFP. So great, we've got a plan. Are we going to use it as a doorstop, or are we going to use it to change the world? How will the biodiversity finance plan be institutionalized in your country?
Okay, first of all, good morning, everyone. So in the Seychelles, we've already done most of the steps of the BIOFIN, and we've worked on the final draft of our biodiversity plan. But what we realized quite early on is some of the solutions that we were proposing, similar to what Tracy was saying, we saw that most of them will not actually be implementable during the lifespan of the project. So we thought about how we could make it work after the project ends, which is the end of this year. So we are using some of the resources or the help that we're getting under the project to get ourselves organized, and in setting the necessary arrangements, the frameworks, for us to put in place what we will be calling the Biodiversity Finance Unit. So this small unit, which will eventually sit within the Ministry of Environment and Energy and Climate Change, will have as its role to continue the work that started, so implementation of the Biodiversity Finance Plan. But on top of that, we want this small unit to not only focus on biodiversity finance, but in looking at integrating biodiversity finance into the environmental, raising resources for environmental management within the country. So we have set out some tasks or some things that we want the biodiversity finance unit to focus on, so the objectives. And we want the BFU to facilitate, to coordinate and synergize amongst all ongoing biodiversity initiatives in the country, and also to help mainstream biodiversity into economic and budgetary processes, so into the national budgeting processes, to look at where we're getting international donor funds and see how we can write new projects that will help us to achieve some of the solutions that we have identified during the time that we were working on our biodiversity finance plan. At the moment, under the BIOFIN, we are only working on 2 of our solutions. which is on tourism and biosecurity, but there are others that we know are important and that we will need to be focusing on, such as fisheries, which is very topical in the country right now when we are working on our marine spatial planning. So the idea really is to have this overarching coordinating unit that will help us to not only deliver on our biodiversity finance plan, but to deliver on national priorities at the same time. That is where we're at.
Thanks, Morime. So I'm CSR's TA, so I have a little bit of background information. I know about your biosecurity and your tourism finance solutions, and they are very exciting, innovative finance solutions. But even if you didn't have them, just this, what you're doing, institutionalizing the finance plan and creating a unit, is a massive win for BIOFIN, and it's something I would, for other countries to think about. If there's anything you can do along these lines, it would be a huge win for your country. So thank you for my panelists. You're not allowed to go yet, but those are my questions done. I did not bring a watch up. I don't actually know how much time we have left, but 30, we've got lots of time. We are now open to the floor, and we're going to walk around. We've got a mic, and I would say it would be great if you could, if you have a question directed at a particular person, please ask that particular person, otherwise generally, and we'll play tag and figure out who's the best person to respond. There's a question in the front here.
Good morning, everybody. I am from government sector, from India, Member Secretary, Madhya Pradesh State Biodiversity Board. Mine is a very general question. Other than CSR and private funding for biodiversity conservation, what is the factual position of various national governments and federal governments funding the cause of CBD?
Not sure I understood exactly the question.
Basically, we are here focusing about the CSR and private funding for the biodiversity conservation. I am raising one question about the factual position of various national governments at various nations and countries and federal governments within the nations and the actual factual position of their funding for the cause of CBD. And at the same time, institutional support.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were saying. Can I address that? Yeah, so the main source of financing for biodiversity is our national governments, is the national budgeting process. The finance solution that's probably the most important is really good national level and state level budgeting for biodiversity, making sure that you make the case to those decision makers to adequately finance from state budgets, which is income generated from taxes, for biodiversity, because it's a social good, it's a general welfare question, clean water, fresh air, products coming from nature. It's essential. So that's almost your primary first finance solution that we almost, it is up on the wall there somewhere, but it's so important. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And it's and perhaps one of the panelists can talk about how you would address that. So this is one of what BIOFIN does is it looks at that data, and here in India we've done assessments in 2 states as well as at the national level on the amount of funding that comes from state and local and national government on biodiversity. And I suggest you talk to the colleagues here at BIOFIN to get that specific data. I'm not seeing questions.
I think I'm visible. Yeah. You said the nation should own when we try to arrange funds for biodiversity conservation. Nation as a whole and the leadership of the nation as a whole should own that project. But we see It is true in India, maybe true for almost all the countries. India, especially, we have federal structure. So the views of the leadership that is there in different states, that varies from state to state. And it varies from political parties to different political parties. And I have seen in many places, within political parties also, it varies from leaders to leaders. Suppose somebody is made aware, maybe he is able to appreciate the problem of biodiversity, lack of funding for biodiversity conservation better, and some others are not. In fact, I give an example of my own state. Though a very progressive state in India, when we were arguing a case for biodiversity and forestry allocations, they said, what is your outturn? How much revenue you give out of your forestry investments? We have a very well laid out policy. Forestry is not for giving revenue to you. There is a policy of 1988 in our country, which is basically to green the country, enhance the forest cover. In fact, this year we have got good forest cover increase, and our state has taken the lead in that. And it has to give a lot of intangible benefits, which you can't measure in monetary terms. And when we want to counter question, when you allocate for education, what is the outcome you get from education? When you look at medical and health, how much you get? And do policing, how much you get? Nothing. Only maybe when you allocate some fund for commercial taxes department, maybe you can get some revenue. Income tax, you can get some revenue. So forestry should not be viewed, biodiversity should not be viewed as a sector to give you revenue in turn. You invest 1 and you get 10, that is not the case here. But very often, despite the fact we keep on convincing them time and again, some people may get convinced and they allocate, but even then, overall if you see the entire nation's picture, the allocation in this sector is very, very meager. So what I feel that benefit is definitely there, but there is a need to, as we said in the earlier presentation, there is social benefit, 120 euros or something, that says so many euros. So there is a need to work on each of the parameters, what all benefit it gives, and let us monetize that. And then only we can convince in real term. Like we had one vague data that one tree in its entire lifetime can give 50 lakh rupees. Like is, yeah, so my suggestion is not a real question, my suggestion is we have to have a focus group working on all the benefits which flows out of biodiversity conservation. And once you quantify this, then only you'll be able to convince the political bosses, the people who matter most. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah. Hugo, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I would agree, and I mean maybe just 2 examples from Georgia. We found that the kinds of valuation studies, ecosystem services valuation, for example, as an economist is the kind of thing I'm doing here and there, they are lacking, and that is because there's maybe not such an awareness of those kinds of pieces of work, and because there's just not a lot of primary research on that, for example, in Georgia. So one of the solutions, part of it is to try and essentially influence the research agenda for academic institutions. So I think it's kind of a win-win. Academic institutions are trying to find topics that are really relevant and policy relevant, and the government, on the other hand, is sort of saying, look, we don't have enough ecosystem services research and other research, which in the longer term we need more of in order to make our case and to make our argument, you know, along the lines of what you're saying. But I would agree, yes, it's tricky because biodiversity is very cross-cutting, but as much as is possible, I think one needs to have a longer-term vision for this, for more of this information to be at hand for the days when you need to make your case.
Just a brief comment. In developing the financial plan, it is almost impossible to have perfect information about the benefit and the cost. That will be, I mean, for most of the country out of the question. So in a few cases, you will have perfect information to make a very rational decision. In most of the cases, you will have to apply some more soft analysis type of quality opinion expert to make it possible. Otherwise, if you wait for the, the perfect data, it will never happen. You will never have a plan. That's why in the case of Chile, we call it more than a financial plan, a strategic plan to look forward to see how we can mobilize the society as well as the private sector and the government behind the biodiversity policies.
Thanks. That's great. And a final reflection from my side is when we went into BIOFIN and throughout the implementation of it, we were very clear that this was not a valuation study. BIOFIN is almost everything except valuing ecosystem services and biodiversity. But when we were working on our finance solutions, we actually had a meeting quite early on with some officials in Treasury, and we were talking to them about all sorts of fancy finance mechanisms that you can see up on that wall, exciting, sexy ones. And Treasury said to us, can we stop talking about these things? The biggest problem that you have is that your provincial conservation agencies are sitting in budget meetings and they are not able to communicate the socio-economic value of protected areas in the provinces. Please, can you help them do that? So we had to step back and say, hang on, this is something that maybe BIOFIN can help. And one of our finance solutions is developing a case for provincial protected area agencies to take to budget meetings. So, I think the way we went about that meant that even though we ended up proposing valuation studies, it was very targeted valuation studies that we knew Treasury was actually asking for. Question in the front here?
Thank you. I just want to ask a question, like Tracy mentioned about the way forward in terms of establishing or creating a unit within the Ministry of Environment, and they do the implementation of biodiversity. So I just want to add on to the ask the reps from Chile and South Africa, how do you take this forward in terms of any separate organizations or department or unit within to take forward your implementation of biodiversity?
We are closely working with our counterpart at the Ministry of the Environment in Chile. There's no special unit or department responsible, it's just the whole ministry. But the key question here, more than the environmental ministry, is to see how we can engage the Ministry of Finance, because some of the changes that we are proposing require a lot of political will from a macroeconomic point of view, and we are in the process of developing the capacity building to be able to lead to implement the financial plan. Within the financial plan, we made a proposal for to institutionalize the plan, and we are still working with the ministry to see how we can move ahead on this. But this is a more complex process than just to say we are going to do this department or this unit, etc., because it requires a lot of political decision. We are in the middle of political change. We have a new government, and that requires new conversation from the part of the BIOFIN Chile and the UNDP with the new authorities. So we are in a transition process to say the positive thing is that with the financial plan has been shared with key stakeholders at the government. Some of them will change. That's one of the challenges that we have. But that's the reality of the country. Country have democracy, they have new government, new authorities, and that required a lot of political skill to put the financial plan in the public agenda.
So I'm just going to comment on Georgia, and then I think Tracy's better placed for the South African question. But I think it's similar to what you were saying with Chile. There's a need to do a fair amount of capacity building, I think, at the outset, and then the institutionalization in that case, I think, would evolve from there, and the interest, I think, will develop. But yeah, some of the Georgian solutions, or many of them, have a component that are about essentially capacity building.
Thanks, Hugo. So from South Africa's side, South Africa was one of the few countries where BIOFIN wasn't actually implemented out of country office. It was implemented, the project leader sat in the Department of Environmental Affairs as a staff member. So it started out kind of relatively institutionalized already. It was owned by government, and I went to all the department meetings and was on the organogram, sort of. So it started off being relatively institutionalized, which was, I think, a great move. It did mean reporting to 2 different entities, which was exhausting at times, but otherwise I think it was a great move. Going forward, I think there are a lot of opportunities for institutionalizing both the plan and the project as you implement. It's when you're doing a BER or the costing the NBSAP, it is technical, and it is a lot of time behind a laptop, and it's sometimes hard to bring in a lot of stakeholders and make them feel ownership of something other than a few workshops. But when you start implementing finance solutions, it's much broader, and a lot of the finance solutions can actually be driven or code-developed by other partners. And there's a great opportunity there for BIOFIN to play a convening role, bringing all the actors together, whether it be other government institutions or NGOs or other projects, bringing them together and holding that space for biodiversity finance, even though they're not necessarily leading on everything. And it's a bit of a soft institutionalization, but I think that can be very powerful. And then there's obviously the harder institutionalization of, the question will come up whether you're finishing in phase 1 or you're finishing sometime at the end of phase 2, or when that date gets finally is ended, is the department able to create a post that they will carry, even if it's not a full unit, that can continue looking at biodiversity going forward? And I think that will be influenced by how well BIOFIN performs and integrates and convenes the space while BIOFIN is actually running and donor funded.
If I can just add on to what Tracy was saying, I think really it doesn't really matter whether it sits within the Ministry of Environment or within the Ministry of Finance, but I think moving forward it is just useful to have a group of people or a few people that are actually going around coordinating and making sure that the finance solutions that you have identified are being implemented, because even for us, some of our finance solutions are not being implemented directly by the ministry. Like, for instance, the biosecurity is going to be implemented by the Biosecurity Agency, and the tourism solutions by the Department of Tourism and the Seychelles Tourism Board. But we will just need to have sort of the overarching role, making sure that things are being done in alignment to what we set off to do. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? I believe we've got 10 minutes left. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, when we started BIOFIN, we started with the premise that there is a limitation of resources in the country, so therefore we should look for innovative sources of financing. Now, I think we should continue to consider, especially NBSAP Target 1, creating awareness. And awareness can be created at 2 levels. One is involving the planning and finance ministries. I think in many of our countries, the planning ministries and finance ministries are not fully aware of first of all, the existence of the NBSAP, and secondly, the importance of biodiversity. And that goes more at the local government level, where when you ask them to prioritize, biodiversity is going to get one of the least priorities in terms of their resource allocation. So therefore, I think while we look for innovative sources of financing, we should not ignore the fact that these agencies play a very important role in resource prioritization. The question is now, my second part of the thing is on the question. Now we are looking at the finance plan. In our country also we have reached the finance plan, and the intention is now we hand it over to the government. So the question is, so what? Now, whether the government will take full ownership of the finance plan is a question that we need to ask. And then we are supposed to come up with an exit strategy. Now, of course, handing over this plan to the government can be one component of the exit strategy. So my question probably maybe to the BIOFIN team is, what will be the role of BIOFIN in the exit strategy, and what will be the components we should think of when we prepare this exit strategy for the business plan? Thank you.
Thanks. Dave, I see you nodding vigorously. Do you want to respond to that?
Yes. So the finance plan, so I think that a lot of the panel had already talked about institutionalization and trying to use the finance plan process to build engagement. The term exit strategy is something that I choose not to use at all, more a sustainability strategy, and every solution in and of itself can be thought of as has to have its own sustainability strategy. How do you get ownership of each solution in the key government agency or the key partner to take that on, so that you end up not with a document but with a process, so that the quote exit strategy or sustainability strategy is built into every single one of the finance solutions that are in that plan, so that the plan itself is just an aggregation of a range of processes that summarizes actions and opportunities that you've been developing all along.
Thanks, Dave. I would say let's take 2 more questions, but before we do that, just to say we do have the open space section after tea, and I will be hosting BFP. So if anyone wants to discuss BFP more, has more questions, I'll be sitting at a table and you can come and speak to me, and I can rope in other people as well. So if you don't get your question in now, you've got another hour and a half or something like that to get it in later. But let's see if there are any more questions before we break. I think I've now given you permission to not ask questions. Are there any final thoughts from the panel before we close?
One final observation. I think when you develop a financial plan, you should think in the short run and in the long run. And one way is not to be shy to improve existing mechanism, existing budget expenditure, because there's a room there to immediately increase budgeting for biodiversity initiative. And then, because the development of a new mechanism takes time, a lot of in some countries, it has to go through Congress. There are some important technical and political decisions. It will take 4, 5, 6 years. So pay attention to the existing one to see how you can improve it, and from then build on to the rest of the plan.
Yeah, so I would also just comment on the institutionalization and sustainability. And we've got, at this event, we've got various political people around, ministers, deputy ministers. I think that is already a sign that one is getting interest. And it's not always easy for every country to have that, but yeah, one has to work on getting those political champions, which is often, I suppose, many of us are not really suited to that role, but I think one has to push it a bit and try to do that. And we, for example, for Georgia, we have the Deputy Minister of Environment Protection and Agriculture here, which we're hoping is a step in the right direction for BIOFIN generally. And yeah, those are the kind of things that one needs to do. And I suppose my parting shot is also just to say the BFP process, it's got its challenges, but I think it is by far the most satisfying part of the BIOFIN process. And yeah, I'm hoping you'll all you're all enthusiastic and looking forward to diving into it, those of you that are yet to start. It's a lot of fun.
I guess Hugo had said a lot of the things that I was thinking, actually said it. I guess what I can add on is just to make sure that when you're doing the process, you engage all your stakeholders, all your actors, everyone that you know you will be needing further down the line. You engage them, you keep them interested in the process so that when you have the plan ready, then it makes implementation, because everybody will feel that they own it, they've contributed towards it, and they would want to see it succeed.
Thank you so much. Panelists, thank you for your insight and for your time. Dave, thanks for your presentation. And thank you to the audience for participating. You are free.